So, in a BBC that I did a couple of weeks ago, I focused on one of the stereotypes that we sometimes come across in Buddhist teachings about women, saying that women tend to be more emotional than men. And in that BBC, I posed a number of questions about what this actually means, and also reported on some studies that have been done to investigate whether it's true or not. So, what I found is that it's actually a common idea around the world. And at least one conclusion about the studies that have been done is that many researchers have concluded that the observed emotional differences between men and women primarily stem from socialized gender roles rather than biology. Thus, the range of emotional expression that certain populations experience is based in a large part on their culture's expectations for femininity and masculinity. So it seems to me that in general, men and women, or males and females, do have the same emotions, but there can be differences in the way they are expressed by different genders. And these differences are in large part due to how we are conditioned. For example, girls often get the message that they should be emotional, nurturing, non-aggressive, and obedient, while boys often get the message that they should be unemotional, aggressive, achievement-oriented, and self-reliant. So, of course, this is just talking in general, and there are certainly exceptions about how children are raised based on different family environments and their schools, society, and so on. So I had a few more thoughts about this topic that I'd like to share today. So one is that if it's true that women are more emotional than men, they would create more crimes than men. Because most, if not all, crimes are committed under the influence of afflictive emotions, such as anger or hatred, which leads to crimes like murder, rape, and assault, and also greed or attachment, which leads to things like theft, extortion, drug dealing, and substance abuse. So one way to determine who commits more crimes is to look at prison populations by gender. Of course, not everyone in prison has actually committed a crime. We've heard stories of people who are wrongly convicted of crimes they did not commit. But my guess is probably the majority of people in prison have done something they shouldn't have done. So what do we find when looking at prison populations? So in the United States, the most recent figures I've found for this year, 2020, are that there is a total of 2.2 million inmates. And of these, 219,000 are women. So that's a bit less than 10%, meaning that a bit more than 90% are men. And in Israel, the figures are even more dramatic. When I was there last winter, I met a woman who had been teaching meditation in prisons, and she told me there were far more men than women. And I looked up the actual figures, and there were 20,000 total inmates, and of those, 99% are men, and only 1% are women, 200 women. And other countries probably have similar figures, that the vast majority of people in prison are males. So do we want to make a statement about this, that men are more likely to commit crimes and end up in prison than women are? I think it's better not to make generalizations. I mean, there are people on both sides, both genders, who commit crimes and end up in prison, but probably the majority of people, both men and women, do not. But my guess is that when this kind of statement is made that women are more emotional than men, they're probably not referring to things like anger and rage that lead to violent crimes. Instead, they're probably talking about emotions like being upset and crying, sad, maybe anxiety. And I just had a brief look, and it seems that studies do show that women cry more than men, sometimes twice as many times. But there are various factors as to why this is the case. Some are hormonal, some are cultural, some are even political. And nevertheless, men do feel sad and do sometimes cry. And some years ago, I was in Bulgaria doing a retreat, a 1-month Vipassana Mahamudra retreat, led by Venerable Antonio Satta. He's an Italian monk who often led these retreats. And I think there were about 100 people, and the schedule was quite intense, very few breaks, and a lot of sitting and walking meditations and total silence. And only in the evening he would give a talk. So one afternoon, as all of us were sitting in the meditation hall, silently doing our practice, there were the sounds of a woman sobbing somewhere in the back of the room. I don't know who it was, but I'm sure everybody in the room heard her. And it went on for quite a while, and we just continued sitting still and focusing on our meditation. But I'm sure everyone did hear it and probably had different internal responses: curiosity, empathy, maybe annoyance, maybe criticalness. And that evening in his talk, Venerable Antonio said something about the crying. And I don't remember the exact words that he said, but it was something like, women's tears flow outside like a river, and men's tears flow inside like an underground stream. And I thought that was quite beautiful for several reasons. One, that he acknowledged, the crying and didn't just ignore it and pretend it didn't happen. And he didn't speak about it in a negative way, in a critical way, in a condescending way, but acknowledged that we all cry, but in different ways. We all have tears, we all have sadness, and in different ways. So I thought that was quite a nice comment, and it perhaps also united us, focusing on our shared humanity. But for me, it was also interesting just that, yeah, there are differences. Men cry too. Men have sadness too, have tears too, but they may show them or experience them or express them in different ways. Another thing too, that when that kind of statement is made that women are more emotional than men, it seems to have a negative connotation. And I mean, is it really negative to be emotional? There's actually many different kinds of emotions. And some are more negative, like anger and rage, because they lead to suffering. They lead to suffering for others, but also suffering for oneself, because they can lead us to create negative actions. But not all emotions are negative. Some are positive, such as compassion and kindness and generosity, empathy. And there are studies that have shown that women do have more empathy and compassion than men. I don't know if these are final studies or they're still looking at it, but the Dalai Lama talks about this sometime. He's heard about this, and he's even made the suggestion that if more women became leaders in politics and in other areas, we might have less war. Things might go better in the world. And that's kind of what apparent in this recent pandemic. A number of people have pointed out how those countries that have women leaders, like New Zealand, Taiwan, and in several of the Nordic countries, Iceland and Finland and so on, they've had a really effective and, fantastic responses to the COVID crisis. And the countries with the worst responses are under male leadership. And there was an article the other day on the BBC News about the wearing of masks. And it's been found that women have been much more compliant about wearing masks than men. And a study was done here in America of almost 2,500 people. And it's found that men were not only less inclined to wear face masks than women, but they also considered that donning a mask was shameful, not cool, and a sign of weakness. Anyway, So there's lots of differences we can see between men and women. But I think with any of these stereotypes, like statements like women being more emotional than men, I think we need to question, what does that actually mean? And investigate to see if there's really, evidence for this, or if it's just a prejudice that's been carried down for many generations. So I think that when we do hear such statements, there are such statements in the Buddhist teachings, and we tend to just, buy into them. But we shouldn't just blindly believe them, take them on board, repeat them to others, but instead question them and investigate them. And remember that at best they are only generalizations. They may apply to some people, but certainly not to everyone. And I think in general it's better if we can deal with people on an individual basis, one by one, rather than through the filters of stereotypes. So in coming BBCs, I was thinking I would like to share stories of some women practitioners, because in the history of Buddhism we hear a lot about male meditators and teachers and writers of texts and so on, but almost no stories of women. There are wonderful women in the history of Buddhism who've done wonderful things, so I'd like to share some stories of those. Very inspiring for us, and maybe help to overcome some of these stereotypes as well. Thank you.